Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Stuart Welsh. Hi, Stuart.
Good afternoon, Kieran. Long time no see.
Good to have you back on the podcast. It's been a while, and we're going to explore, the ways we can support pupils who have English as an additional language in mathematics. I think it's worth saying before we properly get going that friend of the podcast, Dr. Robert Sharples, alluded to a special project the last time he was on the podcast, a project that was designed to provide support for teachers and schools who are keen to support pupils who use English as an additional language. And that project now exists. It's called HEDDLE, EAL, HEDDLE. And because Robert is such a big fan of the podcast, he's offering TDAPE listeners a special offer. And we're not sponsored by HEDDLE, but it feels like this is the kind of resource our listeners will be interested in. And so you can use the code TDAPE, TDAPE, at the checkout for the equivalent of a month for free. And there's also a pretty extensive free community at heddle-eal.com, #join. And like I say, this is the kind of thing I think we need in schools. This is the kind of support we need as teachers. And so I'm more than happy to point people in the direction of Robert and in particular HEDDLE, EAL. Important to preface the episode with the position that having or using English as an additional language isn't necessarily a deficit. And actually, quite often when pupils have long enough in the country where they're learning a second language, they'll quite often outperform, given enough time. So for instance, if a child were to come into primary school around about the start of Key Stage 2, by the time they get to GCSE, their level of language will be such that actually they can perform quite well. So we're not approaching it from that. It's not but it can be challenging in the meantime for teachers, certainly Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2, and potentially Key Stage 3 as well. And so in your experience, Stuart, what challenges might pupils who have English as an additional language face? And are there any reasons perhaps why those challenges may exist?
Kieran, I think you're absolutely right with the preface there. In my experience, I've seen many students struggle as they've joined school because English is an additional language for them, and yet I've seen so many get through that and flourish. And a lot of the things that we can do to support them are actually things that we would probably want to do to support a lot of students anyway, regardless of whether they are English as additional language students or not. So certainly in my experience, having worked in independent schools and international schools, this can manifest at any time in a learner's journey, because that environment can quite often be quite transient, and students are joining and leaving schools for various different reasons, quite often coming from different countries. And so not having that same grasp of English as a language as perhaps their peers can initially be quite daunting, and it can be quite taxing on the students as well, because I think they get frustrated, particularly when perhaps they've had success with mathematics in their own language or in other countries before moving, and then suddenly they feel there's this barrier in place. So I've seen it with young students, I've seen it all the way through the school, and the sort of things that it might manifest itself in would be very often word problems. The algebra tends to be the algebra. That's the common language that we have throughout mathematics, but it's as soon as we get into the word problems that students may be meeting terms that they're unfamiliar with. And I've heard people say that mathematics is that universal language, and a lot of the terms in mathematics come from perhaps a Greek origin, or perhaps they're Latin, or perhaps they're Arabic in origin, and in there lies the problem, because already we're seeing mathematics and the vocabulary associated with it drawing from all sorts of different sources. So I think it's a challenge for a lot of students to learn mathematics because of the new and unfamiliar language that comes in, but it's obviously much more challenging for students who haven't had their mathematics instruction in the same language. Going hand in hand with that is the fact that I think we're probably still a little bit guilty, maybe not quite as much now, as there's been more sort of awareness placed on a sort of multicultural group of students. But I think we have in the past been guilty of using terms that are quite local to perhaps the one country, whether it's just simple things like the names that we choose for individuals who might be in a word-based problem, or the context that they're in. I don't think I've ever seen a question about students dancing around a maypole, for example, but that's the sort of thing that would immediately throw another learner off and is maybe unnecessary. And I'm sure we'll get to that later on when we talk about how we can kind of support these EAL learners.
I mean, I think there are two challenges that really impact on people's engagement with mathematics. Now, obviously, we're focusing specifically on mathematics, but I think both problem solving and language comprehension require the use of working memory. And so we know that working memory is limited by design or by definition. So if we're trying to give these two competing, I don't know, ideas or processes or, I don't know, concepts, all of our attention, and we know how important attention is, then at some point that's going to become burdensome and you're almost going to be overloaded in terms of how much we could think about at one time. So I think working memory, certainly a lot of the meta-analyses that I've read with regards to language and with regards to problem solving would suggest that both put a particular burden on the use of working memory. So I think that could be a challenge. That could be frustrating because we know that when we're trying to solve, for instance, a particularly challenging or difficult or well-constructed maths problem, it takes a lot of thought and it can be frustrating, but the payoff is much greater whenever you finally find the solution. So I think that's something to consider. And I also think that, and I think I may have mentioned this before, there's a disproportionate influence that language has on mathematics, and in particular mathematics assessments. Because you mentioned word problems there, Stuart. I think there's a large part of primary schooling where you're coming from those early fundamental structures, which can be introduced almost entirely devoid of language. Then you've got this period where you go through where essentially it feels like everything's being assessed through a worded problem, certainly statutorily and also informally. So I think those are the two things. We've got this big chunk of primary school where the word problem or language impacts on how we assess people's competency in mathematics, proficiency in mathematics, and also we've got working memory, which I think is the thing that's most likely to cause people's frustration in the moment, that frustration you describe.
Very much agree with that. I think we'll come back to the working memory in a moment, but just whilst you were talking there, it was making me think about students that I've worked with who are EAL, but also students who are just maybe struggling a little bit more with their language. And there is a danger that we misidentify their struggles as a lack of sort of mathematical understanding or dare I say ability. And what we really must make sure we avoid is watering down the content that we start to give to those students and devaluing their experience by not challenging them because of a false assumption that they can't do the mathematics when actually they probably can do the mathematics, and it's the language that is sort of screening that or blocking that. And your point, I think, about moving from very early conceptualization of mathematical structures, which can be done with some sort of concrete manipulative or perhaps something like a visual representation, doing that at the very beginning of the mathematical journey, and then suddenly taking those concepts and wrapping them up in trips to the shops and Best Buy deals in the supermarket and things like that, is a sort of big chunk of the middle of that mathematical journey. And so for students who are not confident with the language, you get this situation where, and this leads on to working memory, where you don't just have them trying to strategize a solution path through a problem. And that takes enough cognitive capacity as it is just to try and plan a solution path through a problem. But then to know that in that problem somewhere you have to simplify a fraction or something like that. And to simplify that fraction, it relies on quick and accurate recall of sort of tables, facts and things. To then throw on top of that the cognitive burden of trying to decipher the context of the question, you can very, very quickly see why that working memory would become overburdened and overloaded. And so we must really be aware of that as a challenge for EAL students and also other students who are struggling and think about ways that we can support them.
In your classroom, did you ever explicitly teach vocabulary? Because that's normally one of the first things that people mention. Like, what would that look like, if you were doing advanced, I don't know, almost pre-teaching of vocabulary that pupils need in a mathematics classroom?
So the answer is yes. I think that's really important, so that when students do start meeting problems, whether it's mathematics specific, and that would be the larger proportion of the vocabulary that I would pre-teach, or whether it is just sort of contextual stuff that will allow the students to access the problems a little bit more easily. I think that it is really important that we try and define some of these terms, and that we try and encourage students to perhaps form some sort of glossary of mathematical terms that they can refer to. And there's definitely been times when I have had students have a sort of bilingual glossary running at the same time, so they've actually got the terminology, and then they've translated it into the language they may be more comfortable with, but then they've also got the English language. And so to try and front load that burden and introduce students to terms, even if it's terms like addition and subtraction and things like that all students kind of need to meet through mathematics. We want to be making sure that those are visual somewhere, whether they're actually on a word wall or something like that for students, where they can go to. They know they've got a place to go and perhaps peel back the label and see what the definition is, and just try and have that additional type of scaffolding in there. It's nice to be able to get students to try and talk through their thinking. So even if it's a little bit of problem solving that they're trying to describe the process, or even just the solution steps to something more routine, when they're trying to describe the process, there's real value in taking the time to encourage the students to use as many mathematical words as they can. And again, I think this goes for all students, and perhaps using sort of think, pair, share type exercises, where perhaps pairing an EAL student with a student that's more sort of fluent in English, and then encouraging them to work together to sort of produce definitions and to understand terms. So I think over the years I've incorporated strategies like those to try and give students the extra scaffolding and the extra sort of resources that they need to decipher and to decode the languages.
One of the things you said there about this almost this predetermined bank, or understanding what those words are going to be, actually reminds me of a question I get asked quite frequently, and it's like, where do we have this bank? And there are lots of sort of like multi or bilingual dictionaries, but I think it's very important that whatever list you have matches up with your curriculum. And so, for instance, subject lead, someone who is sort of responsible for ensuring the sort of quality of teaching in mathematics in the school should at some point, I think, go through, potentially during the quieter months of July, because we know how sort of free and easy the summer term is, perhaps look through and say, okay, here are the words that pupils are going to need to know. So then we can do that kind of forward planning. And always, I like your think per share idea. Whenever I am considering sort of the role of language, and to be honest, like you said at the start, it's just as true for pupils who have English as an additional language as it is for those pupils who are just learning English, like for instance, Key Stage 1, early years, and almost got like this two-pronged approach where we think about the mathematical language that we want pupils to use, maybe a term in advance included in spelling lists, perhaps knowledge organizers if we use knowledge organizers. With those slightly older children, maybe looking at morphology, because we've got all these Greek, Arabic, and Latin origins, and maybe Middle French and Middle English origins too. I think the morphology element isn't necessarily as, it's quite a task to get your head around it, but I do think there may be some value in it. And so we essentially, hopefully, the key sort of mathematical terminology, pupils understand it before they encounter it in the lesson, so to speak. And then the second prong is considering those incidental words, and perhaps even the phonics in word problems, because I think this is the one that perhaps gets overlooked. But often in a language, it's not the Latin cognates that are challenging for pupils. Say, for instance, if you learn a Romance language, lots of the words are going to share sort of commonalities, but it's the in between words. It's the short words. It's the words that get overlooked. And so thinking about which words are absolutely necessary in a given word problem, because we will have to encounter word problems. It's a legitimate way of exploring mathematics. But are words necessary at all? For instance, I don't know if you want to talk about your experience recently where you were drawing apples, because you were working with year one pupils. The word apple may not be appropriate for the pupils at that stage, but you could very easily represent that. And, so I think it's considering, will pupils be able to read the words? Should they be expected to read the words at their point in the sort of language development trajectory? And then which words do I absolutely need here? And there may even be put SATs papers into AI and ask what the most common phrases used, so we can then be aware of which incidental words, are we most likely to encounter, because we can't remove the language entirely because the system of assessment is based so heavily around language, but we may be able to predict what they're likely to encounter, and it may be that we're with us long enough that actually the key stage 2 assessments are fine, but we should probably be doing what we can to focus on the mathematics, like you said, as opposed to the secretarial or the linguistic.
It is nuanced to some extent, because what we want to, I think, still be aiming for is for all of our students to be able to confidently read and process a question that is set in context, and to be able to make sense of what's going on in that scenario. However, going back to that working memory type idea, why put that extra barrier up at the beginning? If it's the mathematics that is our primary aim in terms of what we want them to learn, then let's look at ways that we can strip back that unnecessary and possibly even distracting content and extra information. And so you mentioned the apples there. I was working with some year one and year two students, and it was exactly that. We just had two characters on the board, just a picture of each of them, and we had a bucket of apples, and then we were able to build from that slide a whole story of questions where Ben had 5 apples and Emma had 3 apples, and how many more did Ben have? None of that was written, all of that was spoken, because really what we were wanting to get at was just this idea of comparison, that structure underlying the problem in there. And it makes me think of other examples like that, further up the school, particularly when you're doing sort of percentage change. There's a lot of scope for word problems there. In fact, I think sometimes maybe content authors really push themselves to find bizarre contexts for items to have gone up or down in value, and actually, an image of a violin, for example, with a minus 20% tag on it and just a price next to that. The story is there. This thing was this, has been reduced by that. What is the price now? And I've certainly done lessons where, and I'm no mean artist, but actually just drawing items on the board and putting a reduction tag on them, because I don't need them to wade through a sentence to try and understand what's going on there. I want them just to be focusing in on that mathematics. But as I say, it's nuanced, because we do want them to eventually be able to cope with a written question. And your idea of analysing common exam papers and seeing, are there some key phrases and key structures that exist, I think would probably show that there are, very much. I think as teachers, with that kind of curse of knowledge, whenever we see an exam question, we probably don't read the whole thing, because I think we're probably able to recognise the structure almost instantaneously, which isn't helpful for our students, because we need to backtrack to the times when we weren't able to do that instantaneously. And that doesn't stop as you go through mathematics. That doesn't stop at word problems. That carries on all the way up through into more complicated algebraic, trigonometric, calculus type questions. When you see them on the page, you ignore this sort of superfluous context, and you sort of, an expert mathematician has trained themselves to just focus right in on the key structure that's inside that question. And so I suppose that's where we're aiming for in the end. So it's kind of interesting. We could actually ask the question: Does context ever matter in these questions? And should we really just try and thin down the way we assess students' mathematics by purely as finding ways to assess them on the mathematics? The more I think about it, the more I think that probably is a good idea.
The only thing I would say to that is that a lot of those structures of arithmetic are purely contextual, in as much as the difference between aggregation and augmentation isn't it, symbolically, you're going to write 5 plus 1. But whether you're increasing something or combining two distinct groups, that's the only time you probably come a cropper. Maybe it's a case of whenever people are older and they're thinking about those, because it's almost as once you've got that arithmetic reasoning down, you can then start thinking about those big laws that govern, your sort of laws of arithmetic, your field axioms and stuff. And maybe that, I don't know if that is that your primary concern, more so than the structures, which are, I think, heavily contextual. I don't know, would that match up with your sort of experience of? Do you focus more on those bigger ideas, those bigger governing structures, or quite often with the smaller arithmetic and multiplicative structures?
And I'm sure many people might disagree, but I think in a general sense, in the schools that I've been in and the schools that I've visited and the teachers I've spoken with, the focus is probably narrower on those smaller sort of incidental kind of structures that crop up in the curriculum as we go, rather than maybe a sort of bigger picture plan to weave in the field axioms as you're talking about. And I'm sure that there are some students that their teachers give them a really rich experience and exposure and show those connections and show the axioms appearing over and over again, and how they start very, very early in the mathematical sort of story and continue all the way through. And I think there are some students who probably don't get anything like that at all, and that, as you say, it is very much this is a takeaway question, or this is a division question, but not because of deep structural reasons, just because there are words in the question that tell you that it's division type thing. It is the right thing to do is to employ teaching strategies that are going to support all of our students, as much as possible. I think I've said a few times before, the smartest move probably is the move that we can make as a teacher to move the most number of students forward at one time, whatever that relates to in terms of instruction or teaching techniques. And so if we're looking to support EAL students, then I think we want to be looking at strategies that will support them regardless of what level of English they do have, and also obviously regardless of the language and their background. What might the role of technology be in supporting EAL students? And are we at a stage where we should maybe revisit mobile phones in students' hands in a lesson and things like that?
The negatives of mobile phone usage greatly outweigh any advantage you might gain from this. I think even with the advancements in things like artificial intelligence and stuff, the translation applications, don't really offer much more that, like you said, people going and making their own glossary, or being provided with key terms and definitions. I think, if every child got an iPad or whatever in the class, if that's something your school's decided to do, then perhaps, there's that app that can translate in images in real time. Maybe that might be useful. But I think, keeping mathematics as low tech as possible, geometric software aside, I think is probably, my preference, because I think, the sort of disadvantages, I'm not, you have to gain quite a lot to actually outweigh the sort of negatives that are at play there.
I think I would probably be inclined to agree with you for both those main reasons. One of them is obviously the distraction factor that phones might bring, but also I would hazard a guess that if you find a student hovering their camera over a word problem to translate it back into a language that they are comfortable with, that the next time they meet a word problem with some of those same words in it, they'll hover their camera phone over it again, because they haven't maybe taken on board the connection between the English and their own language and learnt those words. Whereas what we're discussing there with building a word bank and a vocabulary, etc., having the students look those words up, I feel that's more likely to become permanent in their memory. So even if it's more of a struggle initially, as so much of learning is, the reward may well be greater later on if they struggle through. I mean, I've certainly seen students doing exactly that, and part of the reason is because through no fault of their own, the teacher is overwhelmed during that lesson. You know, these students have joined midterm, they've joined GCSE, so there's a group of students already in that class who are struggling just with the maths and all over the levels, and then suddenly there's this new student in who doesn't really have a word of English, and you know, in an ideal world there'll be support measures in place, all sorts of things going on there, but in the reality of this particular classroom I was in, you know, that teacher said the mobile phone's great, Google Translate's fantastic here, because it just means that this child can get on with something, and that I'm not spending the entire lesson, you know, just trying to nurse them through one question type of thing. So it's tricky, isn't it, to find a balance, because what we really need to avoid is students sitting in a lesson just wasting time, just lost and wasting an opportunity.
I mean, in that situation, I'd go like total word-free mathematics. You know, when their immediate priority is learning English, and they may be getting sort of some intensive support with that, then you know that's the priority. But whenever if they really must engage with mathematical ideas, which obviously we know they should, then I think what we do is we just go sans vocabulary, you know, and get them engaging with the same mathematics, but on a purely symbolic level, or with representations of, you know, in two-dimensional space, you know. But yeah, that I mean, if we can very quickly help them get up to speed with English, you know, where they're the only people in the class and they don't have any English, and it would really benefit them to learn quickly, then I think we prioritize that, you know, because we know that once that's in place, the rest of it just flies, you know, and it becomes a really rapid process after that. You know, I think it's you know, really interesting there you said, you know, sometimes it may take more effort. I think with languages, anything that sticks, you will have had to work hard to make it stick. You know, it's attached to a piece of a memory, a situation, a context. You know, it's hard won. You know, you keep using, is it the imperative tense you keep using in Spanish? We keep giving me orders. And you know, you know, there's definitely a backstory there. You've that's a hard one. You're like, why is this person doing this? You know, and those are the bits that stick. Whereas if you just gloss over something, like you say, you'll gloss over it again the next time, the next time, the next time, the next time, and you know, you won't get it.
It actually kind of goes back to that sort of sat nav sort of metaphor that maybe Tom Sherrington, it may not have been him, but somebody certainly talked about, you know, just continually correcting. It's just like a sat nav's the worst thing for human navigation ever, because you'll end up using your Google Maps or whatever to get you from A to B, you know, up to 10 times. And then on the 11th time, if you don't have your Google Maps, you don't know the way. And so having all that extra support and scaffolding and all those moment by moment corrections, you don't ever spread your own wings and fly. You know, you're constrained by that. So I think you're absolutely right. You know, you talked there about learning other languages, and I think that it's an immensely rewarding experience for anybody. And it's amazing how much you rely on your own knowledge of your own language, but also just I think your own exposure to the world in the sense that there are words in different languages that suddenly make sense because you can relate them to something else. They come from the same origin or whatever. But what do you say to teachers in the if you know whether they should be purposefully trying to pick up a few words in a foreign language to support those students who are coming to their lessons with that as their home language? Is that us going backwards because, you know, we're aiming to have everyone speaking English and understanding the English, or is there a potential sort of middle ground where teachers could be saying, well, you know, this term actually is this in the language you'd be familiar with?
I mean, for me, it goes back to something that Rob Sharples mentioned. I mean, it seemed like the thing at the core of his message was that we want these pupils to feel safe, and we want them, you know, to let them know that everything's going to be okay, you know, regardless of what context their sort of move has sort of come under. And so, you know, by learning those little phrases, you know, I would always learn to say good morning and good afternoon in the language that the pupils, and then maybe see you later. Whatever the different sort of terminology used in the school day. Maybe try and pick it up. Did that extend as far as mathematical terminology? I'm not sure, because we will get to modeling of the school of everything I say, and that has got a mathematical purpose behind it. But I don't see why not. And quite often they will be very similar. But I think in terms of making people feel safe and accepted and things like that, there's value in those little bits and pieces. Because it's impossible. Say we've got 13, 14 languages in our class. It's impossible to know them all, but there are definitely ways we can sort of make pupils feel like their language is just as valuable as English. Um, Even though we can't be masters of them all. So that's where I'd be coming from. I mean, we said we keep this one short because I wasn't feeling well, but we've gone on for quite a bit already. But I do think modeling is something that's worth considering, and there are things that I've sort of picked up from other people and then utilized in situations where perhaps people have or use English as an additional language, but equally with all pupils in the class, like you said. I think Craig Barton talked about the silent teacher and silent modeling. I think the silent teacher has two meanings if you search it online, but essentially this is modeling without sort of narration over the top of it. And I think it can be really, really useful because it allows pupils to spend their attention. We talked about that working memory. It allows them to spend their attention just on the model. I think there will be some explanation necessary. And I'm pretty sure Craig says that afterwards, you make sure you explain what the decisions you made. But I think that could be really useful. But equally, if we are really clear in the representations and we are clear in the labeling, talking about those words that we need, we cannot then, we can almost use narration. It's not a case if we only ever do one of these. It's here are all the options at our disposal, and so things like dual coding, where we're very carefully labeling, so pupils are listening and seeing, two different sort of parts of the same message. I think can be really powerful. And then something that I've seen Gareth Metcalf explain really well is slow reveal problem solving, where he'll show you a bit of a problem and then he'll reveal a little bit more, and then there's a bit of a conversation or a thinking time about what might the problem be, what might it be representing, and I think that can be really good because then again it allows that thinking without as much of a burden. Like on Enrich, there are old, or not necessarily old, I suppose they are old, but there are graphs that show Olympic records over time, and you get a sense for what the graph's trying to tell you without the label on the graph. And it's that kind of idea where we're are we getting a sense of what's being represented here, because obviously the 100 meters has a very different trajectory to the high jump, and those graphs are going to look very different over time. Yeah, so those would be the three things. I mean, not just those three things, but I'd be considering, okay, what can I do with my modeling? What does sort of the research show in terms of effective modeling that I can utilize with pupils in my class, that pupils who use English as an additional language will benefit from, but equally I think everybody benefits from too.
It's almost as if it's boiling down to a few kind of fundamental principles for us as teachers. A lot of what I think we've talked about is just sort of decluttering, streamlining. We can perhaps simplify language in places, but let's not simplify the mathematics along with it. You've talked a little bit about the different models, and I think we know that concrete models and blocks, things like that, fraction walls, pictorial representations, all of those things support any learners in mathematics in terms of developing conceptual understanding, and they do to some extent remove the language, because you're able to make sense of it in your own way. So that dual coding sense of being able to give words and images at the same time, I think would mean that our EAL students will have more chance of success when they're able to see in front of them what is being described to them visually. And the silent teacher is something that I've certainly employed a few times in different schools and different contexts to great success. The feedback from students, regardless of whatever their first language is, was that they were able to concentrate much more on each stage, and they didn't feel they were distracted basically by me as the teacher. And that goes right back to the working memory at the beginning. And for students whose first language is not English, then taking out this sort of teacher prattling away in the background, and we know that teachers say far too many words mostly anyway. We need to cut to the chase. But if we strip it right back down to that silent teacher approach, and certainly one sort of model of it, or one interpretation of the silent teacher, is to some extent just a kind of live enactment of the worked example effect, with the teacher just providing line by line solutions and students sort of studying the progression from line 1 to line 2, what's happened there, line 2 to line 3. And we do see a lot of teachers doing a sort of example problem pair approach, or an I do, we do. And I think there's potentially a little bit of a disconnect in the I do, we do with the worked example effect, because really, to get maximum benefit, we do want the students spending a bit of time thinking about how we get from one step to another. There's a fine line between explicit instruction and then just throwing the students in there and making them figure out every single step. But silent teacher is probably a bridge between the two, and if it has that additional benefit of decluttering the cognitive load and supporting students with EAL, then I think it's a very powerful strategy for teachers to explore and to employ.
Yeah, and I think you've decluttered my explanation as well. So double decluttering, and which I think would be really useful. Yeah, because it is about thinking about what are our options, what can we do, and then sort of testing out, and then seeing if it worked. If it didn't, we'll try something different. Which is basically what we do in teaching, is that we refine our practice, and each of the our modeling will change depending on the context, the difficulty of the mathematics, and so I think I think it's a sensible way to approach it, and certainly maybe a start when trying to overcome those challenges that pupils might face when they are using English as an additional language, but also trying to engage meaningfully with mathematics. I think I'd be very keen to know what anyone listening does, what strategies they utilize. I don't know if you want to let us know in the comments wherever you're listening. Only one thing to sort of mention before we sort of wrap things up, Stuart. That's obviously on January 18th. We've got the Thinking Deeply About Primary Education conference being held in London. And we have just closed the speaker workshop proposal window. We've had some very, very generous speakers sort of give up their time to help us raise money for the Belinda Cancer Centre. And so we're just sort of signposting that the tickets are available, and you can check out the wonderfully generous speakers on the Eventbrite page. And yeah, hopefully look forward to seeing you at that. But I really enjoyed this chat. Thank you for helping me get through it, Stuart, because like I said, not feeling 100% this week. And all I had to do is say thank you very much for joining me.
You're very welcome, Kieran. It's been a pleasure, as always.
And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.